"You're not a soldier, you're just a woman in a war," Captain James Morgan muttered under his breath, but even his own words couldn't shield him from the sight before him. The sun hung low in the Texas sky, casting a golden hue over the camp as the dust swirled lazily in the afternoon air. The makeshift hospital tent was filled with the sound of quiet murmurs and the rustle of military boots on the dry ground. In the center of the chaos stood a figure who seemed out of place, Liesl Muller, a German POW, her white nurse's uniform still pristine despite the carnage around her. She moved with quiet purpose, her hands expertly tending to the wounds of a young American soldier, Private Bill Thompson. His face was pale, his breath shallow, but her steady hand seemed to offer a peace amidst the turmoil. Captain Morgan watched, his jaw tightening. Liesl had been ordered to stay away from the soldiers, to only tend to the German prisoners. But here she was, breaking protocol. He stood there, unable to shake the feeling that something about the scene before him didn't fit into the neatly defined roles of enemy and ally. He wasn't sure what to make of it yet, but he knew it felt wrong in a way he couldn't explain. As the officer, his job was simple: follow the orders. The army said no fraternization, no exceptions. But here she was, this woman, defying everything he knew, ignoring the consequences of her actions. "Stop," Captain Morgan finally commanded, his voice rough as he crossed the threshold of the tent. The words were meant to be firm, to remind her of her place in this war. But instead, they hung in the air like a hollow echo. Liesl didn't even look up. Her hands remained steady on Private Bill's chest, her brow furrowed with concentration as she applied a clean bandage over his wound. She was caught in a moment that transcended the violence of the war. She wasn't just a German nurse tending to an American soldier. She was a human being tending to another human being in need. Captain Morgan's breath caught in his throat as he watched her, his mind racing. He could order her to stop, force her to obey, but something inside him recoiled at the idea. Instead, he stood frozen, watching the quiet defiance in Liesl's posture. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she spoke, her voice calm, but firm. "He needs this. You know that." It wasn't a question. It wasn't a plea. It was a statement of fact. Captain Morgan swallowed hard, unsure of what to do. This wasn't the enemy he had been told to fear. This wasn't a monster. This was a woman, just like his mother had been, just like his sister. His eyes softened for a brief second before he caught himself, remembering where he was. "You're not supposed to be doing this," he said, his voice low but strained. "The orders," he was cut off by her gentle but insistent gaze. "And what do you want me to do, Captain? Leave him to die?" The silence that followed was deafening. Liesl didn't back down. She wasn't there for politics, or for war. She was there to save lives. That was her job. And in that moment, her job mattered more than any military order. Captain Morgan stepped back, his hand resting on the doorframe as the reality of the situation hit him. He had been a soldier, trained to follow orders, to see things in black and white. But Liesl was showing him something else, a quiet humanity that defied the lines drawn by war. He turned away, his heart pounding. He couldn't explain it, but he knew one thing for certain: the war hadn't just broken Liesl. It had broken him, too. The days that followed felt like they stretched on forever, each one heavier than the last. The heat of Texas summer pressed down relentlessly, but it was nothing compared to the weight of what Captain Morgan had witnessed. Each time he passed by the medical tent, he could feel his thoughts shifting, his resolve starting to erode. The image of Liesl Muller, her hands steady and unyielding as she worked on Private Bill Thompson, stayed with him. It gnawed at him, made him question everything. She had disobeyed orders, yes, but she had done so out of a genuine desire to help. He couldn't ignore that. The camp had been quiet for days. The other soldiers went about their business, maintaining their distance, but there was an undercurrent of tension that no one spoke of. Liesl wasn't just a prisoner anymore. She wasn't simply a German nurse doing her duty. She had become Something else in the eyes of those who watched her, something that challenged everything they had been told about the enemy. One afternoon, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, Captain Morgan found himself walking towards the medical tent again. His footsteps were slow, deliberate, as though something in him had been drawn forward, despite the part of him that resisted. He stood at the entrance, watching as Liesl bent over Private Bill, tending to his wounds with quiet precision. The other soldiers had gone off on their duties, leaving Liesl alone with the injured man. Her concentration was total, and for a moment, Captain Morgan felt a pang of guilt for questioning her actions. He stepped inside without a word, and Liesl didn't flinch, didn't even look up. There was no need for her to speak. She knew he was there. He could see it in the way she moved, in the way her hands never hesitated as she worked. "He's going to make it," Liesl said softly, her voice carrying the weight of certainty. He's strong. Her words hung in the air between them. She wasn't asking for permission. She wasn't waiting for his approval. She was simply stating the truth. "You shouldn't be doing this," Captain Morgan muttered under his breath, though his tone lacked the force it had once held. They'll find out. She paused for a moment, finally looking up at him. Her eyes were steady, her gaze unwavering. "Let them find out," she said quietly. "I'm doing what I know is right." There was a long silence, and for the first time since he had arrived at the camp, Captain Morgan wasn't sure if the rules he had always followed still mattered. What did it mean to be an officer if he couldn't see the humanity in the people he was supposed to fight against? What did it mean to be a soldier if he couldn't recognize when compassion was needed? Liesl wasn't asking for forgiveness. She wasn't pleading for sympathy. She was simply doing her job, even though it was one that the world told her she had no right to do. The nurse returned to her work, her hands continuing their task with careful determination. It was a small thing. A seemingly insignificant moment. But for Captain Morgan, it was a turning point. He didn't know what to say, so he didn't say anything. He just stood there, watching as Liesl finished. When she was done, she gently placed a clean bandage on Private Bill's chest and stepped back, wiping the sweat from her brow. For a moment, the air between them felt thick, charged with something neither of them could name. Then, as if to break the tension, Liesl offered him a small, almost imperceptible smile. He'll live. Thanks to you, he'll make it through this. The words were simple, but the truth behind them was undeniable. She wasn't thanking him for his orders, for his rank. She was thanking him for something far more fundamental. For seeing her as a person. And in that moment, Captain Morgan understood that he wasn't just following orders anymore. He was beginning to question the very nature of the war he was fighting. The days bled together in a haze of heat and silence. The war felt far away here, in the isolated camp under the scorching Texas sun, yet it was ever present in the quiet tension that had settled over the soldiers and prisoners alike. Captain Morgan found himself walking toward the medical tent every day, sometimes without even realizing it. It wasn't just because of his duty as an officer, it was because of Liesl Muller. There was something magnetic about her, something that made him feel like he was at a crossroads. His mind was torn between the rigid military code he had been trained to follow and the undeniable humanity he saw in her actions. He couldn't shake the image of her hands working tirelessly to save a man she had been told to ignore, to see only as an enemy. The camp was quieter now, the days stretching longer under the weight of the summer sun. Liesl still went about her duties, tending to the prisoners with the same meticulous care. It was clear she wasn't just doing a job, she was driven by something deeper, something that pushed her to act despite the war around her. The soldiers had started to look at her differently. At first, they had kept their distance, unsure of what to make of a German woman who seemed to care more about the lives of the injured than the politics of war. But over time, something shifted. They began to see her not as an enemy, but as a person. Captain Morgan couldn't quite pinpoint when it happened, but he noticed it every time he walked into the tent. The soldiers were no longer cold or dismissive. They spoke to Liesel as if she were one of them, as if the lines of nationality and enemy had blurred into something less defined. One evening, after a long day of managing camp duties, Captain Morgan found himself standing outside the medical tent once again. He hadn't planned to, but his feet had led him here without conscious thought. He stood in the shadow of the canvas, watching Liesel as she cleaned the instruments and prepared for the next round of care. She looked up, catching his gaze, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was comfortable, a shared understanding that neither was willing to acknowledge out loud. Liesel finally broke the silence, her voice soft but steady. You know, Captain, I never wanted to be here. I didn't think you did, Captain Morgan replied, surprised by the ease with which the words came. None of us did. There was a pause, a moment of shared vulnerability. But you still do what you have to do. Liesel nodded slowly, wiping her hands on a cloth before folding it neatly. We all have our duty. Mine is to help people. It doesn't matter where they come from or what side they're on. Captain Morgan looked at her, his mind spinning. She had been raised on the same propaganda as every other soldier, taught to believe in the superiority of her own country and the righteousness of their cause. And yet, here she was, doing the work that no one expected her to do, helping the very men who were fighting against everything she had been taught to stand for. The realization hit him like a weight to the chest. Liesel wasn't just a German nurse. She was something more, someone who had the courage to defy the boundaries that the war had drawn around them. You're not like the others, Captain Morgan said quietly, more to himself than to her. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to read him. I'm just a woman who believes in doing what's right, she said simply. There was no bitterness in her voice, no anger. Just quiet conviction. In that moment, Captain Morgan understood something he hadn't before. The war, with all its violence and destruction, had created lines between people that seemed impossible to cross. But Liesel had crossed those lines without even thinking about it. She had done what she believed was right, regardless of the consequences. And for the first time since arriving at the camp, Captain Morgan wasn't sure which side of the line he was supposed to be on. The following days passed with a strange tension hanging in the air, thicker than the Texas heat that never seemed to let up. Captain Morgan continued his daily rounds, but each step felt heavier, as if the weight of his responsibilities had grown too large for his shoulders. The camp had begun to shift, ever so slightly, in its daily rhythms. The soldiers were no longer treating Liesel Müller like a mere prisoner of war. There was a quiet respect in their eyes now, something that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just that she was performing her duties well, it was something deeper, something that couldn't be easily explained. They had started seeing her as a person, not just a label. Captain Morgan noticed the change, but he didn't know what to make of it. The boundaries between us and them had always been so clear. Soldiers and prisoners. Allies and enemies. But here, in this camp, it was no longer that simple. Every time Liesel spoke to a soldier, whether it was asking about a patient or handing out supplies, he could see it in their eyes, they were beginning to question the things they had been taught. And he couldn't help but wonder if they weren't also questioning him. Captain Morgan stood outside the medical tent again, watching as Liesel worked. She was bent over Private Bill Thompson, her hands deftly dressing his wound. For a moment, he just watched, his thoughts wandering to places they shouldn't be. He had known this man for years, fought beside him in the trenches, but Liesel treated him with the same care she treated every other patient. She didn't see him as an enemy, just as a person in need. And for some reason, that made everything else seem so much more complicated. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel beneath him. The sound seemed to break the spell. Liesel looked up and smiled at him, her face soft. But focused. He's doing better, she said, her voice low but steady. It'll be a long recovery, but he'll make it. Captain Morgan nodded, unsure of what to say. It wasn't just Private Bill's injury that weighed on his mind anymore. It was Liesel. Her presence in the camp had become a constant, a reminder of the things that war couldn't touch: compassion, humanity, kindness. It was so easy to forget those things in the heat of battle, when every decision felt like life or death. But here, in this moment, they seemed so much more important than anything else. "I don't know how you do it," Captain Morgan said, his voice rough, almost as if he were speaking to himself. How you can keep doing this, day after day, with everything that's happened. Liesel paused, looking at him with a mixture of sadness and understanding in her eyes. "Because it's the only thing I can do," she said softly. I don't have control over the war, over what happens to us. But I do have control over how I treat the people around me. That's what matters." The simplicity of her words struck him hard. Captain Morgan had always prided himself on being a soldier, on following orders, on doing what was necessary. But in that moment, he realized that perhaps Liesel was the one who understood what was truly necessary. She wasn't just following orders. She was making a choice every day to do what she believed was right, despite the consequences. And Captain Morgan began to wonder if he could do the same. Could he continue to follow orders, even when those orders conflicted with the very humanity that Liesel had reminded him of? It wasn't an easy question to answer. As he stood there, looking at her, he could feel the weight of that decision pressing down on him. It was as though Liesel had opened his eyes to something he had been too afraid to see. The war had blurred everything. But in the midst of it, she had found a way to keep things clear. She had chosen to see people for who they were, not what they were. And now, standing in that dusty camp, Captain Morgan wasn't sure where that left him. He was an officer, trained to think in black and white. But here, with Liesel, everything felt gray. The days began to blur together as the war inched forward, relentless and unforgiving. Yet, there was something different about the camp now, something that couldn't be ignored. Captain Morgan had always believed in the black and white lines that divided the soldiers from the prisoners, the allies from the enemy. But after spending time with Liesel Muller, he found himself questioning those lines more and more. She had made him see the war differently, or perhaps it was not the war, but the people involved in it, that had changed in his eyes. Liesel was still a German POW, still the enemy by every technicality, but she had become something else in his mind, a person, a woman, a nurse. She was human, just like him, just like the men who fought alongside him. He had seen the way she cared for the injured, the way she treated each person, enemy or not, with dignity and respect. But it was the small things that really began to weigh on him. The way Liesel would smile at the wounded soldiers when they were able to sit up, the way she spoke to them softly, as if reminding them they were more than just their injuries. She wasn't just doing her job, she was giving them something none of the other soldiers could: hope. It was an impossible thing to ignore, especially for a man like Captain Morgan, whose life had been consumed by duty, by orders. But now, every time he passed by the medical tent, he felt a tug in his chest, a nagging feeling that wouldn't go away. He didn't know why, but he had started to look at Liesel with a kind of admiration. It wasn't the admiration one would expect from a soldier toward a prisoner. It was something more, something complex and, at times, confusing. She had never asked for anything from him, but in a way, she had given him everything. She had shown him a side of humanity that had been buried under the weight of uniforms and battlefields. But Captain Morgan still wasn't sure where he stood. He had been ordered to maintain the camp, to keep things running smoothly, to enforce the rules. And the rules had been clear. No fraternization. No exceptions. But he couldn't shake the feeling that Liesel was changing the very fabric of those rules, without ever intending to. One evening, after the last of the wounded soldiers had been cared for, Captain Morgan found himself walking into the medical tent again. This time, he wasn't there for any particular reason, at least, that's what he told himself. He simply wanted to check on the men. But as he stepped inside, he found Liesel alone, organizing her supplies. She didn't seem surprised to see him. Instead, she greeted him with a quiet nod. "You're still here," she said, her voice carrying that familiar calmness. I thought you would have been off to handle something else by now. I had some time, Captain Morgan replied, though he wasn't sure why he had stayed. He didn't really want to talk about the war, about orders, or about anything that had brought them here. How are they doing? Better, Liesel said, her voice steady, but there was a tiredness to it. The wounds will heal in time. But it's the mental scars that worry me the most. What do you mean? The men, some of them, they're more broken inside than they are outside. They're fighting a war that will never truly end for them. Captain Morgan looked at her, her words hitting him harder than he expected. He had spent so much time focusing on the battle in front of him that he hadn't stopped to think about the long-term toll it took on those involved. Soldiers didn't just fight for victory, they fought to survive, to come home. And not everyone would make it. How do you help them? He asked quietly. Liesel paused, her hands stilling as she looked up at him. I can't fix everything, she said softly. But I can make sure they know someone sees them. Someone cares. Captain Morgan felt a pang in his chest. He wasn't sure if it was admiration or guilt. But whatever it was, it wouldn't go away. He stood there for a long moment, watching Liesel as she moved to organize the bandages. In that moment, he realized something he had been trying to avoid: Liesel wasn't just a German POW anymore. She was someone who had given him a glimpse of a different way of being, one that valued compassion over conflict, peace over war. And in that quiet moment, he knew that nothing would ever be the same. The days had begun to feel endless, but something in the air had changed. The heat of Texas was unrelenting. The land stretching out under an unforgiving sun. Yet, Captain Morgan found himself not noticing the usual discomfort of the environment. His thoughts were consumed by the camp and the people within it. It wasn't just the soldiers he had spent years fighting alongside anymore. It was Liesel Müller, the German POW, who had somehow become a quiet force in his life. Every day, she carried out her work with the same precision, the same care for every wounded soldier. But now, every time he saw her, it felt different. The admiration he had for her, for the way she moved through the world so determinedly, despite the circumstances, had grown into something else. He wasn't sure what to call it, but it was undeniable. The soldiers in the camp, once wary of Liesel, had begun to accept her in a way that surprised him. They didn't see her as just a prisoner anymore, but as someone who had proved herself time and time again. It was in the way they spoke to her, the way they trusted her. It was subtle at first, a brief nod, a polite question about a patient's condition, but over time, it had become something more. Captain Morgan couldn't ignore it. Every time he walked into the medical tent now, he saw Liesel not just as a nurse, not just as a German prisoner, but as a human being doing the right thing in a world that had lost its way. It was hard for him to reconcile the person she had become with the enemy he had been trained to fight. One evening, after a long day, Captain Morgan found himself standing outside the medical tent once again. He hadn't planned to come. But as he stood there, watching Liesel tending to the injured, something within him shifted. He had spent so many years following orders, keeping his emotions in check, but now, everything seemed more complicated. He stepped inside without a word, his presence felt before it was even acknowledged. Liesel didn't look up immediately, but there was a sense of calm in her movements that somehow put him at ease. How are they? He asked, his voice quieter than he had intended. Better, Liesel replied, her eyes still focused on her work, but it's going to take time. Healing takes time, and not just physically. Captain Morgan watched her for a moment longer before speaking again. I've been thinking, about everything. The words felt awkward on his tongue, but they were true. About what's right. About what we're really fighting for. Asterisk she paused, meeting his gaze for the first time that evening. Her eyes were steady, but there was something behind them, a quiet understanding. We're fighting because we believe it's right, she said, her voice soft but firm. Asterisk, but sometimes, what's right isn't always what's easy. Asterisk the weight of her words settled over him, heavier than the heat outside. For a moment, he wasn't sure how to respond. The world had always been clear to him, divided into enemies and allies, right and wrong. But Liesel had a way of making everything feel gray. I never thought I'd see the day where I'd question what I've been taught, Captain Morgan admitted, almost to himself. Asterisk, but I can't ignore what's happening here. What you're doing. It's making me see things differently. Asterisk Liesel gave him a small smile, one that was gentle, almost like she understood everything he was trying to say without him needing to explain it all. It's not easy, she said quietly. Asterisk, but it's the only way to live with yourself at the end of the day. Asterisk her words echoed in his mind long after the conversation ended. Captain Morgan found himself returning to those words again and again, as the days stretched on. He couldn't go back to the way things had been. The lines between right and wrong, enemy and ally, had blurred for him in a way he couldn't undo. And as much as he wanted to hold on to the world he had known, he couldn't ignore the truth anymore. Liesel had changed him, in ways he didn't fully understand. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was starting to see the world as it truly was. The camp had settled into an uneasy rhythm, a sense of normalcy that felt foreign. Captain Morgan had never imagined that he would find himself standing at this crossroad, questioning everything he had known. The war had always been clear-cut in his mind. It was simple, he was a soldier, fighting for what was right, for his country, for his comrades. The enemy was the enemy, and there were no two ways about it. But as the days passed, he began to feel something shift deep within him. Every time he saw Liesel Müller, the German POW nurse, something inside him stirred. She had a quiet strength, a resilience that was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just her ability to heal the wounded, it was the way she treated everyone with the same dignity and respect, no matter which side of the war they were on. Captain Morgan had witnessed this firsthand. He had watched her tend to soldiers with the same care she gave to her fellow prisoners, seen the way she spoke to them, not as enemies, but as people. He couldn't explain it, but something about it unsettled him. It wasn't supposed to be this way. She wasn't supposed to make him question the very foundation of everything he had been taught. One evening, after a long day of managing the camp, Captain Morgan found himself walking toward the medical tent again. He didn't know why he was going, it wasn't like he had any pressing duties to attend to. But his feet led him there, as though something inside him was pulling him in that direction. He stepped inside and found Liesel sitting alone, the faint light from the oil lamps casting shadows on the walls. She was organizing her supplies, as usual, her movements methodical and calm. She looked up when he entered, her gaze meeting his with the same quiet intensity that had come to define her. "You seem troubled, Captain," she said softly, her voice carrying the same calmness it always did. Asterisk, is everything all right? Asterisk Captain Morgan hesitated for a moment before speaking, his mind racing with thoughts he wasn't sure how to voice. "I'm not sure," he said slowly. Asterisk, I've been thinking a lot lately. About what's happening here, about the war. About you. Asterisk there was no bitterness in his voice, no anger, just a quiet confusion. Liesel didn't say anything at first, but her eyes softened, as though she understood the weight of his words without needing to hear the rest of them. "I know it's hard," she said after a moment. Asterisk, war changes people. It makes everything seem simpler. But it isn't. It's never as simple as it looks from the outside. Asterisk her words struck him harder than he had expected. He had always seen things in black and white. There was the enemy, and then there was everyone else. But Liesel had made him realize that the lines weren't so easily drawn. People were not defined by their uniforms, by the country they came from, by the battles they fought. People were just people. He didn't know what to say to that. His chest tightened, and for the first time in a long while, he felt uncertain. He had spent so much of his life thinking that the mission came first, that the orders were the only thing that mattered. But now, standing here, looking at Liesel, he wasn't so sure anymore. She had made him see the world differently, more human, more fragile, more complex. He was no longer sure where his duty lay. "I don't know what to believe anymore," he admitted quietly. I've spent my whole life fighting for what I thought was right, for what I thought was good. But now I'm not sure what that even means. Liesel watched him, her eyes thoughtful, as if weighing the depth of his struggle. "It's okay to not know," she said gently. It's okay to question. The hardest part of war isn't the fighting. It's living with the choices we make. And sometimes, the right choice isn't the one that's easy. It's the one that stays with you long after the battle is over. Her words lingered in the air, and Captain Morgan felt them settle deep within him, as though they were marking the beginning of something he wasn't ready to face. He had always known war as something distant, something to fight through, to endure. But Liesel had shown him that war was not just about the battle, it was about the people who fought it, the people who lived through it. And he was beginning to understand that the hardest part of it all wasn't the enemy, it was finding a way to remain human in the middle of it. As Captain Morgan turned to leave, he glanced back at Liesel, who was now quietly continuing her work. She had given him something that was impossible to ignore. It was a question that would stay with him for a long time: what does it mean to truly fight for what is right? And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he knew the answer anymore. The days grew longer, the summer sun pressing down like a heavy weight, yet there was a shift in the air, subtle but undeniable. Captain Morgan couldn't shake the feeling that things were changing, not just in the camp, but in himself. The questions that Liesel Müller had sparked within him lingered in his mind, gnawing at him when he was alone, and even when he was surrounded by his fellow soldiers. She had given him something he wasn't ready to face, the realization that the world wasn't just divided between enemies and allies, that right and wrong were not always clear. It was something he hadn't allowed himself to consider in the past. He had always believed in the orders, in the mission, in the uniform he wore. But now, standing under the oppressive heat of the Texas sky, he found himself unsure of where to stand. The tension within him grew with each passing day. The camp had become quieter, less about fighting and more about surviving the slow passage of time. The soldiers continued their work, their duties, but there was something different in their eyes when they spoke to Liesel. She wasn't just a prisoner anymore. She was a person. Captain Morgan noticed how they treated her differently now. There was no more distance, no more distrust. They had come to respect her, to see her as something more than the enemy. They had witnessed her actions, her dedication to saving lives, to doing what was right, regardless of what side she was on. It had a profound effect on everyone around her, including him. He wasn't sure when it happened, but somehow, Liesel had managed to bridge a gap that he thought was unbridgeable. And now, as Captain Morgan stood at the edge of the camp, watching the sun set over the horizon, he felt the weight of that realization sink in. He was no longer sure what it meant to be a soldier, or what it meant to fight for a cause. The rules he had followed for so long felt inadequate now. They didn't account for the people he had met, for the connections that had formed in the middle of a war that had seemed so certain and unchanging. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice. "You look lost," Liesel said, her presence beside him surprising him. He hadn't heard her approach, but now that she was there, he couldn't ignore the way his chest tightened when he saw her. She was standing just a few feet away, her eyes searching his face, as though she could read him like an open book. "I'm not sure where I'm supposed to be anymore," Captain Morgan admitted quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. The war, everything I've known, it doesn't make sense anymore." Liesel didn't say anything at first. She simply stood there, her gaze steady. It was the first time in a long time that he felt like he wasn't alone with his confusion. Maybe it never did make sense, she said after a long pause. Maybe we were just too busy fighting to see that. Her words hit him like a wave, knocking the breath from his chest. He had spent so much of his life seeing things in terms of duty, in terms of right and wrong, good and evil. But now, looking at Liesel, he wasn't sure what any of it meant anymore. I don't know how to fix it, he said, his voice strained. I don't know how to go back to what I was. Liesel stepped closer, her presence calming in a way he hadn't expected. You don't have to fix anything, she said softly. You just have to choose what kind of person you want to be from here on out. The simplicity of her words struck him, and for a moment, he was left speechless. He had been so focused on following orders, on doing his duty, that he hadn't realized he could choose something else. He didn't have to be the soldier who followed orders blindly. He could be someone else. He could be the person who did what was right, not because he was told to, but because it was what he believed in. Captain Morgan looked at Liesel for a long time, the weight of her words settling into his chest. She had shown him something he hadn't known he was looking for, the possibility of change. Not just in the world around him, but in himself. It wasn't an easy thing to accept. But for the first time in a long time, Captain Morgan felt like he was seeing the world for what it was. Not black and white, but a spectrum of gray, filled with choices, with people who could surprise him, who could change him. And in that moment, he made a decision. He wouldn't just follow orders anymore. He would choose what was right, even if it meant walking away from everything he had known. The camp had grown quieter, a subtle shift settling in like the calm before a storm. Captain Morgan still walked its paths, still carried out his duties, but something inside him had changed. Every step felt heavier now, weighed down by the knowledge of what had transpired in his heart. The conversations he once had with his fellow soldiers, the decisions he made without a second thought, all seemed distant. It wasn't just the war that felt far away now, it was the person he used to be. He had found something, or rather, someone, who had made him question everything he had believed in. Liesel Müller, the German POW nurse, had shown him that there was more to life than duty. There was humanity, even in the darkest of circumstances. He hadn't realized how much he needed to see that until she had forced him to. The days passed, and slowly, the war began to fade into the background of his thoughts. He could still feel its pull, its urgency, but it no longer consumed him. Liesel had made him see a different side of the conflict, a side that wasn't just about winning or losing, about enemies or allies, but about people. Real people, who had been caught in something much bigger than themselves. It was an idea that weighed heavily on him. He found himself thinking about the soldiers he had fought alongside, the prisoners he had been taught to see as enemies. They were all just people, after all. People who had families, who had dreams, who had fears. He couldn't ignore that any longer. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Captain Morgan found himself walking toward the medical tent again. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the pull of curiosity, or maybe it was just the need for some kind of closure. He didn't know, but as he stepped inside, he found Liesel sitting on a wooden crate, a stack of papers in front of her. She looked up at him, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked. It was a quiet understanding between them, something that had been growing for weeks, something that neither of them needed to speak aloud. You've been thinking a lot, haven't you? Liesel asked softly, her voice carrying the weight of a question that had no easy answer. I have, Captain Morgan admitted, his voice rougher than he intended. About everything. About what I'm supposed to be doing. About what's right. Liesel didn't say anything at first. She just nodded, as though she understood. You've always known what's right, she said quietly. You've just been afraid to look at it. It's easier to follow orders, to follow the rules. But sometimes, doing what's right isn't the same as doing what you're told. Her words settled around him like a blanket, comforting and heavy all at once. He had spent so much of his life following the rules, doing what was expected of him. He had never questioned it, until now. Until Liesel had made him see that the rules weren't always right, that sometimes the right thing to do wasn't the easiest thing. "I'm not sure what to do now," Captain Morgan confessed, the weight of his confusion pressing down on him. I don't know how to go back to being who I was. Liesel smiled, a small, knowing smile. "You don't have to go back," she said gently. You're not who you were anymore. You've seen the world differently now, and you can't unsee it. But that's okay. You can choose to be someone better, someone who sees the humanity in others, no matter where they come from. Her words hit him like a thunderclap. He had always thought that the choices he made were simple, that he could control them, that he could do what he was told and still be a good man. But now he knew better. Liesel had shown him that the world was far more complicated than that. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't about following orders anymore. It was about choosing who he wanted to be, choosing what kind of man he wanted to become. Captain Morgan took a deep breath, the air around him heavy with the weight of her words. It wasn't an easy thing to accept, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of clarity. The war had made him into something he hadn't fully understood, and now Liesel had shown him that there was more to life than just the fight. He wasn't sure what the future held for him, but he knew one thing for certain: he would never see the world the same way again.